Hello, this is Roger Capello, bringing you episode 48 of my week at the club. And this week I was a little bit surprised. I expected to be playing. No, I don't have don't have the game queued here. Just a minute. Sorry about that. I expected to be playing Ray Paulson, and because it was the last round of this month's tournament, and we both. Well, I guess I had 4 points and he had three and a half. But anyhow, Ray wasn't there, so instead I played. I was pretty well prepared to play Ray. Uh, Instead, I was paired up with Arthur Barlas, and I couldn't remember what Arthur played. So I just kind of took up my standard D4 repertoire and decided to give that a try, such as it is. So I went ahead. Well, before I get into that, I should do a quick astronomy tidbit. And this week, as you can tell, it might have something to do with astronauts on the moon. And what it is I wanted to briefly address the question of how hot is it in space? Because people are forever sort of referring to space as being very cold. And it is in a sense, but not entirely. And I'll explain that. The thing is, temperature and heat are act a little differently in space than what you're accustomed to on the Earth, because there's three main ways, only three ways that heat gets transferred between objects on the Earth. One's by radiation, like infrared or optical, if it's glowing white hot, visual light. That's an important way. That's how we get our heat from the sun. There's conduction. That's when you get in a hot bathtub or it's hot outside or whatever, that you're physically touching the medium, and that's how the heat comes in. And the third way is convection, where you heat something up and carry it away like a cloud. But clearly, convection doesn't happen in space because you have a vacuum there. And it turns out conduction doesn't happen very as importantly as it does on the Earth. I mean, on the Earth, we're sort of in a bath all the time. We're in a bath of air that's keeping us at some temperature. In space, you're in a vacuum, and so you don't have anything to carry away the heat other than something that you happen to physically be touching. Like if you're um, standing on the surface of the moon, you could have some heat carried away through your feet. But that's really the only conductive pathway. So it's almost all entirely radiation, and radiation's not tremendously efficient in carrying heat away from you or bringing heat in. But it is important. And so on the surface of the moon, for example, it depends whether the sun is shining. If the sun is shining, the dirt on the moon, the ground gets very hot, can get up to 260 degrees Fahrenheit, I guess 130 centigrade, something like that. And at nighttime, when it's dark on the moon, it can get down to minus 170 centigrade, which is 250 or something like that, below zero. So that's quite a wide temperature swing. But that's the ground on the moon. The air, there's no air to be getting hot or cold. So unless you're actually touching the ground or being radiated at from the ground, it doesn't matter how hot that ground is. Now, it turns out you are radiated. If the ground heats up, there's a fair amount of heat that you get just warmth basking from the sun. It's like being by a hot fireplace. But interestingly, on the moon, it is, I'm kind of giving it away, but if I had asked you ahead of time, where do you think the coldest place we've measured in the solar system is? Probably get a lot of votes for Pluto. And it's pretty cold, and it did get a temperature measured as we went by. But it turns out the coldest temperature that's been measured in the solar system is actually on the moon. And that's because at the North Pole of the moon, and South Pole too, there are craters where the sun never shines. So the moon's spin axis is almost perpendicular to its orbital plane around the sun. And so there are places where the sun just doesn't get in. And so it's sitting there, and all it's out seeing is the very cold radiation from deep, deep space, which is at 3 degrees Kelvin. And as a result, those craters, the temperature at the North Pole of the moon, one of the craters there, was measured to be 26 degrees Kelvin. That's below 400 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero. So, and that's actually the coldest temperature that's been measured on any body. Even Mercury, that is so close to the sun, a third of our distance from the sun, has ice in the craters at its north pole. So it's an interesting phenomenon that if you don't have direct radiation shining on you in space, and you can get to actually have quite cold temperatures because you start to start experiencing just the radiation of the really deep space, which is so cold. Okay, enough of that. As I was saying before, I expected to play Ray. Instead, I got paired with Arthur Barlas and went ahead and played the D4 move. There we go. And he replied with knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, which is my way of avoiding the Nimzo Indian. If I played knight c3, of course, he could go ahead and pin that knight. And he responded with b6, which gets us into a Queen's Indian by fianchettoing that Queen's bishop on the queen side. The way I like to handle that is to go ahead and fianchetto my own light squared bishop. So I play g3, and we both fianchettoed our bishops. And then Arthur surprised me with a move that I think is a little dubious. He played d6. So normally in this position, the thing you want to do is to develop this dark squared bishop, and normally it would get developed possibly to e7 or down here to b4 with the check. He didn't do either, and instead he played d6. And then the problem is he gets to have a bit of a traffic jam with his pieces here, all trying to use the same squares to get developed. And also it cedes control of much of the board to me. So it's just like that game that I was showing a week or two ago, where the center line between us is actually on the 5th rank, and so white has more space here than black has, and a freer hand for maneuvering. And that becomes important. So I developed my knight. Now that there's no way for him to pin it with his bishop, and he developed that bishop to e7, which is about the only place, unless he fianchettos. I castled, and he played his knight to d7. Okay. So at this point, before the knight gets developed, what he really would like to do, if he could, is to prevent me from playing e4. And there are a couple of ways of doing that. And so what I want to do in turn is to enhance my control over this e4 square right here, right, over this square. And I can do that by playing my queen to c2, right, which then puts another piece attacking that square. So I have 2 attacks, and he can't plop his knight down on it, or his bishop for that matter. I could also push this d pawn and block off his bishop's control of that square. And I realized that, but I was eager to get my rook into the game, and went ahead in this position and played rook e1. I wasn't sure that knight e4 for him would be a good response, but actually it probably would have been a good response for him in this position. And it physically prevents me then from playing e4. Okay, he did not do that. Instead, he castled at that point, which gave me a move to go ahead and play e4. And now at this point, I really think black needs to restrain white's center, because white is just gobbling up control of the center. In particular, I'm possibly threatening e5 here or d5. And during the game, I expected him to play e5 in this position. But understandably, he didn't want to waste time on another pawn move and chose to castle. But that does allow me, oh, I'm sorry, he had already castled. Actually, instead of the pawn move, he played rook b8. So that's a little less understandable. I mean, I can see the desire to get the rook off of this long diagonal here, that my bishop is going to be attacking. Also, his rook there defends his bishop on b7. So it's a reasonable move, but it's I think at this point it would have been more important for him to go ahead and prevent my pawn advance in the center. So he didn't do that, so I played e5. It turns out that this is not a good move. It's not really a bad move, but it throws away most of my advantage. And what Stockfish said, and when I looked at it, I had to agree, was that d5 is actually a better move in this position. And if he does the obvious thing, which is to go ahead and lock up the central pawn position, I can just go ahead and develop my bishop and play on the queen side, basically. I'm going to be playing d4. If his knight comes out here to c5, I could either trade it off immediately, or I could defend this the e4 square some more, like with queen c2, something like that, and then drive the knight away with b4. So this is not really a stable square for his knight to go to, although he could try to prepare it with a4 first. But by playing e5 immediately, what happens, I thought he couldn't really play knight g4 here. I guess I was hallucinating, and thought that he really had to bite the bullet and play knight e8 is what he did play. But I was wrong, and instead, well, first we can trade off a pair of pawns, which he did do, and then instead of playing the knight to e8, he could have played knight g4, and I don't really have a good way to hang on to my e pawn, so I can defend it again with my bishop. He's threatening to trade off my knight. Is the problem. But if I do that, then this is a move I missed. He could have played bishop to c5, and now all of a sudden his knight on g4, instead of looking embarrassed and something I can drive away with h3, is a real threat to my position because he has a double attack on f2. So I missed that move, and for that reason, knight to g4 would have been good. In this line, if I tried to drive him away immediately, instead of defending the e pawn, like so, well, he can just go ahead and trade off my knight. That's what he's threatening to do. I have to take back, either with my bishop or queen. Let's say I take back with my queen, then he's able to win the pawn with one of his knights. And if I move my queen out of the way, or the bishop if I had it there, then he would actually have this knight takes f2 move, which is kind of clever. I didn't see any of this. His computer clued me into it. But after I take it, then he has a knight fork to win the rook back for the two pieces. So it'll be two pieces for a rook and two pawns. So about even trade in material, like so. If I had taken with the queen, he could also have then just come in and forked my queen and rook. So it's an equivalent sort of problem. Okay, so he would have been much better off doing that. Instead, he dropped his knight back to e8, and now he gets a really cramped position. So I looked at for quite a while at this position, and the problem is right here, before I, with white on the move, he's really threatening to play this pawn here to f6 to free his pieces and also to get rid of this cramping pawn on e5. And this is sort of a King's Indian setup I have, where I have this advanced pawn in e5 that I have to maintain. And I have to figure out a way to, keep it there. Otherwise, Black's going to suddenly get quite a good position, I think, after his minor pieces get freed up. And so what I came up with was actually queen to e2. And now the idea behind this, of course, is that if he plays pawn up and I take, if he takes with one of the minor pieces, I have queen takes pawn check, right? Something, just for illustration's sake, bishop takes pawn, I take here check, for example. Now, he doesn't have to take it with the bishop. He could have taken with the rook in this position, but now his rook is going to come quickly under attack, all right, with something like that. Although rook takes knight is kind of interesting. Oh no, rook takes knight doesn't work because if I was thinking that this might save him, but then I can play bishop takes bishop, attacking his queen. So that wouldn't have been any good for him either. And if the rook comes here to g6, it's just going to get, it's too exposed. It's going to get hassled there, and I'll end up winning this e-pawn eventually. Okay, so instead he played c5. Now I'm not a big fan of that move, but again, that's quite an understandable move because you know, he has to do something to develop his pieces, and this way he has a, you know, this is a pathway for this knight to get into the game, or for his queen to play to c on the c7 square, frees up that square, and also stakes out a little territory over there. I defended my pawn again, but more importantly, developed my bishop. I was a little worried at this point that he might play g5. It seemed like that was an interesting idea for black. And what's interesting about it is that, you know, my bishop gets driven away, and it doesn't really have a great square to go to. Maybe I should just show you that. If he plays g5, you know, he has defended twice. I can't really afford to take it. If I play my bishop here, he could trade off the knight and then play knight takes pawn, and there's some complicated tactics, but at least he's at least trading off this pawn, if not winning it. If I retreated my bishop to d2, which I could do, it's going to be in the way of my rook after I move my rook over to d1, which is where I want to move it. Basically, the idea is that I really want to retreat the bishop to c1 if he attacks it, and I want to do it after that a rook is moved. So he didn't attack it. He took time out to get some more control over this b5 square, but that gives me a free hand on center, and I can now play rook d1, pinning that knight. And black's position is getting fairly critical here. Arthur chose to unpin immediately with queen to c7, but of course the only problem with queen to c7 now, I don't know the only problem, but certainly a problem, is that it's being observed by that bishop on the other side of the pawn, so that if there's ever any tactics involving this e-pawn being exchanged or moving, all of a sudden this queen comes immediately under attack. Also, this knight might go to one of those two squares, depending on, you know, can't do it immediately, but at some point in the future, those are attacking squares that attack his queen. So it's not the most secure spot for the queen in the world, but he needed to do something to develop. And so I responded with the knight here to e4, and that's a nice move from white's point of view. It cuts down on the scope of of black's bishop, and also you know, stops the bishop taking this knight kind of tactics that would have been weakening my control over e5. And it also brings this knight over to where it is looking at these two squares as well as possibly g5. So it's got a number of interesting squares under observation, and might be playing knight to g5 very soon with pressure on h7. So it's a nice square, and so he decided to exchange it off, which was understandable, but again, it was a decision that I was fairly happy to see, because then my light squared bishop here on g2 is no longer opposed, and it can become more active. I'm getting command of this whole diagonal, in fact. So what he did next, after exchanging that knight, was to play g6, and that's actually, I think, a good move. It stopped all my ideas of knight to g5 with any kind of mating attack on h7. And it also prepared a way for this knight on e8 to get back in the game. So, not to mention which, it misled me a little bit. So this weakens the dark squares around the king. He has this fianchettoed structure, and now these dark squares here have been weakened as a result of this pawn moving. And I'd like to be able to play on those squares with my knight and my bishop. And so I thought I would play the knight up, maybe move this bishop, move my queen, move the knight back, and then pop the knight into f6 or something like that. So, some sort of maneuvering like that. But I don't really have time to do that, and you'll see how that unfolds. So I think that was not a particularly good move on my part. He played the knight to g7, and all of a sudden I realized, looking at it, that I'm about to have an immediate problem here, because he could, on his next move, come to g5, and once he comes there's nothing stopping him from popping into d4, where that knight would be a real beast in the middle of my position. So I felt that I had to take time out to keep him from going into f5, and so I put my pawn on g4 to cover both of these squares that the knight would want to use. The drawback, of course, is that it weakens my pawn structure somewhat, and weakens my king. But of course, I think in this current position, that's not so important, because the white has it has the initiative here, and it would be several bad things would have to happen for the game to turn around, such that the weakness for white's king starts to become an issue, at least in the near future. In the end game, it definitely could be. But it does give him time to play his rook to d8. And once he does that, then I realized I no longer can maintain control, the control I wanted to maintain over the position. So back in this position, there was this knight here on d7 had nowhere to go, and I was feeling like I really had him bottled up. But now all of a sudden, with the rook playing to d8 like that, this knight, it's clear, is going to go back to b8, and he can trade one or two pairs of rooks off on the d file. And even if I play my rook up and over, it's still just going to be some exchanges. I suppose I could show that to you quickly. So after rook d8, if I was considering playing rook e2, if he played his knight back, it's white's move. I could exchange. Well, I don't have to be the one to. If I exchange, then his rook just gets control of the file. Don't want to do that. So instead, I would double my rooks. But then he can exchange and play his other rook over. And now, chances are two pairs of rooks either are going to go off the board, because otherwise I'd have to totally cede control of the d file to him. So, I really didn't like the looks of this very well. And I was thinking that was going to happen. Right, so this is the position after he played the rook to d8. I did not try to double my rooks, because it felt like it was a hopeless task. Instead, I tried to start up some quick counterplay accelerate my play on the king side. Get this pawn on h4, where I could go to h5, and is threatening either to be exchanged on g6, or in some circumstances to go ahead and push and drive the knight out of g7, and also that's a very awkward situation for a king on the back rank when you have that pawn embedded like that. And he went ahead and did what I expected, which was to play the knight to b8. And so in this position, okay, right here, after he played knight to b8, I thought about the game for quite a while. Thought about my move for quite a while, and didn't like various alternatives. And what I came up with was a little unusual. I played my queen to f3, and what I was thinking was that he would go ahead and take my rook, and rather than recapturing with my queen and protecting the pawn with my bishop, which is sort of what it looks like the point of my queen move was, what I was planning to do was to recapture with the rook. And wait a second, let me come back here a second. Okay. Yeah. What I was thinking about was in this position, if he went ahead and took my rook on d1, that I would recapture with the rook, even though that's weakening my e5 square. And then if he went ahead and took my knight off like so, that I wouldn't want to recapture with the pawn here, because then that pawn formation becomes very fixed, and in particular my dark squared bishop is going to have a hard time getting through to the weaknesses around his king. What I was thinking about doing was taking back with the bishop, and this looks like it's giving up the pawn. In fact, it is, but I could play my bishop to f6 like that, attacking his queen, and his queen actually has to retreat back to c7, and I felt like this would give me pretty good attacking possibilities. I'm controlling this d8 square. I like the looks of this, although it's a healthy advantage for white, but not a winning advantage. Okay. Oh, that was rather long-winded. Sorry about that. So instead of doing that, Arthur played his rook to d4, and the idea here, I think, was to, well, various things, possibly to win this pawn, possibly to double rooks, and I didn't like either of those things, so what I did was just to go ahead and exchange the rook off, and now this gives him an advanced passed pawn here, but whether that's a weakness or a strength remains to be seen, because he doesn't really have a lot of piece support for that pawn. I went ahead and defended my pawn. His queen was attacking my c pawn, and let's scroll this up here a bit so you can see what's coming. See what's coming on later. Stay there. Okay. Oh, right. Yeah, see, it's a good thing for me to look at my notes. At this point, when I played b3, right? His queen's attacking my c pawn. I should have just not worried about that pawn and gone ahead with my attacking scheme. And that was to drop my knight back to e4, where I can get into these dark squares, because that pawn really isn't valuable there. Because if he goes ahead and takes the pawn, then I can come in with my knight check, right? And he takes back with the bishop. I take with the pawn. Now his knight has to go somewhere, and meanwhile, well, where's it going to go? This square is it would be captured by my pawn, and this square, if he goes there, then that blocks off the defense of this knight, and I win the knight. So, it would have been good, but I didn't see that in the game, and so instead I just went ahead and defended that the c pawn with b3. So he got behind his passed pawn with the rook, which is what you're supposed to do. It seemed like a reasonable move. I went ahead and played in front of it so I could obstruct it, blockade it. If given a chance, I was thinking about playing rook to d3 maybe on my next move or very soon. But he drove away my knight first, and my knight had to make a choice about where it went to. Well, there wasn't much to decide there. I wanted to go ahead and play to e4, and then he made a crucial mistake in the game, and that was, well, to be fair, I think think white already had a winning advantage at this point. The eval was even by best play is I have it down here, was 4, ended up being at over +4, but it was at least +2.5 or 3 at this point. And but this accelerates the problems. It jumped up right away to over 7. And the problem is just that, it simply opens up the position in front of his king and is just very weakening. I won't go through the variations here, but the simple, straightforward thing for me to do is to just go ahead and capture it. And then I take with the bishop, and the reason for that is, well, I want to have my knight basically to attack his king. And so if, the bishops go off, this knight is going to be really strong on f6. I'm even threatening now to play knight f6 check. And if the king moves over here, queen over to h3 check. And if he takes with the bishop, then I can take back, and all of a sudden I have real dominance on these dark squares. He trades that bishop off, but I can take back with the knight. Now the f7 square is under strong surveillance, so he can't afford, even though he has his pawn attacked and it's not defended, he can't afford to take the time out to capture that pawn. So instead he played his queen over. Interesting move, attacking my knight, and so I have to take time out to do something about that knight. But there's, once again, I can go back and use that e4 square and threaten to come in through f6 like I want to. He came up to block, or not to block, but to exert some control on his part over this f6 square, but it turns out I can just ignore the fact that he's controlling it and come in with knight to f6 anyhow. He was getting pretty short on time at this point, so he was having to move rapidly, and I actually still had about 10 minutes left, which was a real surprise. A nice change from what usually happens. And now he can't take the knight, because if he does, there's a fork of the two pieces. The pawn takes back, and then this queen and the knight here will both be under attack. So since he can't do that, he has to move the king. He doesn't want to go to h1 and have my queen come over, checkmating him. So instead he goes the other way. But that then allows me to creep in with my queen. He was threatening knight takes pawn. I didn't just want to trade the knights off. I want to keep that strong knight there. And again, he can't trade the knights off himself because of the pawn fork. And the other nice thing is that my queen now has added a second attack to this d4 square, and that pawn is going to fall. My rook will be able to take it. Even though he came out and defended it, but I still have it attacked twice. So I went ahead and took it, and now he can't do any of the sort of obvious moves. And it looks like maybe he could play knight takes knight, but if he does that, this rook is hanging. The knight is pinned. So if he plays knight takes pawn or knight takes knight, this my rook is going to win his rook. If he plays queen takes pawn this way, then I'll just trade the queens off, and the rook is hanging again after the knight recaptures. So instead, he played his knight to e7, and he ran out of time. Right, just as he was making his move, his clock fell and flag fell. So that was the end of the game. What I was thinking about playing, and likely would have happened if we'd kept on playing there, was just to go ahead and take the knight. Assuming he takes back, I would come in with the queen check first, and king has to keep a defense on the rook. I trade the rooks off. And now I can't take the pawn. Well, I can, but I mean, he would interpose with his queen then, and I wouldn't end up winning the knight, but I just take the knight simply. And so here I'd be a piece and a couple of pawns ahead, be a nice easy endgame to win. His king position's very, very weak and very shaky, and my position's good, king position's good. So it'd be easily one endgame. So I guess the one other thing to look at here is a tail of the tape from Lee Chess. Their nice little graph of the chess engine. So here's the game. Here's the eval. Climbed up, and this was the area where I would have allowed him to get back in the game if he had played knight to g4 early on. That was at this point. If he played the knight to g4 and ended up winning this e-pawn as a result, that would have gotten him back to even. He didn't do that, and the eval went back up to +2 or so, close to 2. And then this point right here, where it took this big jump, is at the end there where he played g5 and allowed me to win the g-pawn and break through on the king side. So that was my game. Hope you enjoyed it. And that was also the end of the tournament. I ended up with 5-0 in that tournament, so that was a fun month for me. But next week is start of a new tournament, and Brett Kildall has come back. The last couple of weeks he's been there. He's a fellow he's a USCF master, and right now his rating's 2150 or so, but he's a strong player, and so when I get paired up against him, he's had a very good record against me, and you'll get to see me getting beaten upon for a change. But until then, this is Arthur Barlas saying, have fun pushing those pawns. So long.